For years, I dreamed of the simple joy of sitting at the family table, laughing with my son, his wife, and their children. That's what being a mother means, building memories that last. But one text shattered that dream. It came from my son. "You weren't invited to dinner. My wife doesn't want you there." I stared at the words, my heart breaking. I raised this boy, gave him my love, my sacrifices, and my entire life. And now I was being pushed aside like I didn't matter. My daughter-in-law's rejection stung, but what hurt the most was that my son didn't defend me. But here's the truth. They thought I would just stay quiet, accept their cold dismissal, and fade into the background. They didn't know that I had a plan, and that I was stronger than they imagined. This is the story of a mother who refused to be erased, who turned heartbreak into resilience, and who taught her family that love and respect cannot simply be denied. My name is Anna, and for as long as I can remember, being a mother has been my greatest joy. From the moment I first held my son in my arms, I felt a purpose I had never known before. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, but I was determined to give him every ounce of love and sacrifice I could. When he was little, I worked extra shifts, saved every spare dollar, and even skipped meals sometimes just to make sure he had everything he needed. Birthdays were never lavish, but they were filled with warmth. I remember staying up late at night, sewing costumes for his school plays, baking cakes from scratch, and cheering from the sidelines at every game. As a single mom for many years, it wasn't easy. I didn't have anyone to lean on, but I never let him feel that gap. When other kids had both parents clapping at their recitals, I clapped loud enough for two. When he cried from heartbreak or failure, I was there with open arms. He was my world, my reason to push forward, even when life felt unbearably heavy. And when he grew into a man, when he walked across that stage at graduation, my heart swelled with pride. I thought, this is it. All the sacrifice, all the nights of exhaustion. It was worth it. He hugged me that day and whispered, "Mom, I couldn't have done this without you." I thought those words would live forever in his heart. So when he got married, I believed I wasn't losing a son, but gaining a daughter. I imagined Sunday dinners filled with laughter, holidays where our families blended, and a future where I would finally rest, knowing I had built a home full of love. But life doesn't always unfold the way you dream it will. At first, I ignored the subtle changes, the shorter phone calls, the hurried visits, the way my new daughter-in-law looked at me with polite distance rather than warmth. I told myself it was just adjustment. Families take time to blend. What I didn't know then was that the foundation I had built with love and sacrifice would soon be tested in ways I never expected. My role in my son's life, the place I thought was secure, was about to be questioned, and one text message would change everything I believed about family. After my son's wedding, I noticed the smallest cracks forming. At first they were easy to dismiss. A missed phone call here, a shorter visit there. He used to call me nearly every evening just to chat about his day, sometimes even while driving home from work. But suddenly those calls became less frequent. When I did hear from him, the conversations felt rushed, as though he was saying the words out of obligation, not desire. When I visited their home, I could feel the tension in the air. His wife always smiled, but it was a smile that never reached her eyes. She kept conversations polite, safe, and short. She would check her phone often or excuse herself to the kitchen as though she had something urgent to do. My son, caught in the middle, tried to keep everything balanced. He laughed louder, spoke faster, filled the silence with meaningless chatter, anything to avoid addressing what was happening. I convinced myself it was normal. Newlyweds need space, I told myself. They're building their own rhythm, and I didn't want to intrude. So I gave them room. I waited for the invitations, for the warm dinners, for the chance to be included in their new life. But the silence stretched on longer than I expected. One evening, I decided to surprise them. I baked a lasagna, his favorite dish, the one I used to make every year for his birthday. I thought it would bring back memories, a taste of home. But when I arrived at their door, my daughter-in-law's face fell. She quickly masked it with a smile, but I caught the flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Oh, you didn't have to," she said, taking the dish from my hands with forced gratitude. My son hugged me, but it felt stiff, hurried. We sat together for dinner, but the atmosphere was heavy, like an invisible wall had been built between us. I left that night with tears in my eyes, telling myself again that I was overthinking. But deep down, a seed of fear had been planted. What if I was no longer welcome in the life I had sacrificed everything to build with him? What if, after all these years, the bond we shared was slipping away, not because of something I did wrong, but because someone else decided I no longer belonged? It happened subtly, almost like a whisper in the wind. Family gatherings used to be something we cherished. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, I was always at the center, cooking, laughing, telling stories. But after his marriage, the invitations began to shrink. Sometimes I heard about family dinners only after they happened, when I scrolled past smiling photos online. The first time it stung was Thanksgiving. For as long as I can remember, I roasted the turkey and my son carved it. That year, I waited for his call, expecting the familiar, "Mom, what time should I come over?" Instead, silence. When I finally reached him, he hesitated before saying, "Oh, we're actually having dinner at her parents' place this year." It was kind of last minute. I told him it was fine, that I understood. But when I hung up the phone, my chest felt hollow. Thanksgiving without him was like Christmas without lights, dull, incomplete. The pattern repeated itself. Birthdays became quieter, dinners less frequent, and when I was invited, I noticed how conversations carefully avoided deeper topics. I was there physically, but emotionally I felt shut out. His wife would dominate conversations, talking about her family, her friends, her world. My son would nod along, smiling, rarely turning to ask about me. I began to wonder, did I do something wrong? Did I unknowingly overstep? I replayed moments in my mind, searching for a clue. But the truth revealed itself slowly. It wasn't about me failing as a mother. It was about me being reshaped into a smaller role, one that fit their new life better. The hardest part was the look in my son's eyes. I caught it once, just for a moment, guilt. He knew I was hurting, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap. Or maybe he was too afraid to try. It was a Wednesday evening when my phone buzzed. I smiled, hoping it was my son. In a way, it was. But the words that flashed across the screen made my heart stop. "Mom, you weren't invited to dinner tonight. My wife doesn't want you there." I read it over and over, thinking maybe I misunderstood. My hands shook, and the lasagna I had just placed in the oven suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I sat down, my chest tightening with every breath. The message was short, blunt, and merciless. Not even softened with explanation, not even followed by, "I'm sorry." Just a simple instruction, "You're not wanted." I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? Instead, I sat in the silence of my living room, the ticking clock mocking me with every second. The memories of raising him, every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every sacrifice, flooded my mind. How could it all lead to this? That night I cried harder than I had in years, not just because I wasn't invited to dinner, but because it confirmed my deepest fear. I was being erased from his life. One text at a time. In the days after that text, I found myself trapped in a loop of memories. I walked past his childhood bedroom, still decorated with the posters he loved, the trophies we polished together, the books I used to read to him. The bed was neatly made, the way it always was after he moved out, but I could still picture him there, asleep with his favorite blanket tucked under his chin. I remembered the night he had a fever so high I thought I would lose him. I sat by his bed, holding his hand, whispering prayers into the darkness. I remembered the first time he rode a bike, the first time he told me he loved me, the day he graduated. Every memory felt like a knife now, proof of the love I gave, contrasted against the rejection I was living through. It wasn't just the loss of dinners or holidays. It was the loss of identity. Who was I if not his mother? Who was I if my sacrifices meant nothing in the end? I finally gathered the courage to speak to him face to face. I couldn't live in the shadow of silence anymore. I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee. To my surprise, he agreed. When he walked into the cafe, my heart swelled, but it was quickly crushed by the nervous look on his face. He hugged me lightly and sat down, glancing around as though worried someone might see us. I didn't waste time. "Why did you send me that text?" I asked softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Mom, it's complicated. She feels uncomfortable. She thinks you're too involved. Too involved? I repeated, my voice breaking. I raised you. I gave up everything so you could have a good life. How can being your mother suddenly be too much? He couldn't look me in the eyes. I love you, Mom, but I have to keep peace in my marriage. His words cut deeper than the text ever did. Peace in his marriage came at the cost of me. I realized, in that moment, that I was no longer a priority. I was an obstacle. After that meeting, everything changed. The calls stopped almost completely. The visits were rare and awkward. Holidays passed with no invitations, and the house that once echoed with laughter now sat in suffocating silence. I tried to keep busy, gardening, reading, volunteering, but the emptiness was always there, lurking. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, hoping it was him. More often than not, it wasn't. And when it was, the messages were short, practical, stripped of warmth. I began to grieve, not for a death, but for a relationship I thought was unbreakable. I grieved the boy who once clung to my hand, the young man who once said, "I couldn't have done this without you." That boy was gone, and in his place was a man I no longer recognized. But what I didn't know then was that this silence, this pain, was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a transformation I never expected. That December was the coldest I could remember, not because of the weather, but because of the absence. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. I'd hang lights around the house, bake cookies, and wait for the sound of my son's car pulling into the driveway. It used to be tradition. He and I decorating the tree together, laughing at the old ornaments he'd made in grade school. But that year, the house stayed dark. The tree stood bare in the corner, and every ornament I held felt heavier than the last. I tried calling him on Christmas Eve, but he didn't pick up. Hours later, a text came. "Sorry, Mom, we're spending Christmas with her family this year. I'll call you soon." I stared at the screen, tears blurring my vision. Her family. Always her family. Where did that leave me? I turned off the lights and sat in silence, wondering when I had become the outsider in my own son's life. The loneliness gnawed at me. I set the table for one, pushed food around my plate, and pretended the ache in my chest was something I could swallow down. I tried to remind myself that he was happy. That's what mattered. But as midnight passed, happiness felt like a cruel stranger who had forgotten my address. It wasn't long before my friends began to notice. At book club, someone asked, "How's your son? Newlywed life must be wonderful for him." I forced a smile and nodded, changing the subject quickly. But later, in the car, I broke down. I couldn't bring myself to admit that my son, the boy who once told me I was his hero, barely spoke to me anymore. When I did confide in one close friend, she frowned. "Anna, this isn't right. You deserve to be part of his life." Her words stayed with me. Maybe I had convinced myself this was normal, that all mothers eventually became less important as their children grew older. But this wasn't just distance. It was exclusion. Deliberate, painful exclusion. Every morning I woke up hoping for a call. The silence became its own cruel routine. I'd check my phone dozens of times a day, scrolling through old messages just to hear his words again. I replayed voicemails from years past, his laughter, his "love you," "Mom," as though clinging to an echo could keep me sane. Then one day, I saw a social media post. My son and his wife at a dinner with friends, smiling, wine glasses raised. The caption read, "Family is everything. Family. Everything. Except me." My chest tightened. I realized that it wasn't that he was too busy. He was simply choosing not to include me. I decided to try one more time. His birthday was coming up, and I thought maybe I could rekindle our bond with a simple gesture. I baked his favorite cake, wrapped a small gift, and drove to his house unannounced. When I knocked, his wife opened the door. The look on her face said it all. Annoyance, quickly hidden behind a polite smile. "Oh, you came." My son appeared behind her, surprised, but not in the way I had hoped. He looked uncomfortable, as though I had broken some unspoken rule. We sat awkwardly in the living room, the cake untouched on the table. Conversation was stiff, forced. After an hour, I excused myself. As I drove home, tears blurred the road. I realized I had become a guest in my own son's life, unwelcome and unnecessary. That night I lay awake replaying every moment of his childhood. The sleepless nights when he was sick, the years I worked, double shifts to pay for his school, the joy of watching him graduate. Every sacrifice felt meaningless now. I asked myself over and over, what did I do wrong? But no answer came. The pain of rejection was like a weight pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my pillow damp with tears. One morning, as I was drinking coffee, I caught my reflection in the window. My eyes looked tired, my shoulders slumped. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. That's when it hit me. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for scraps of love from someone who had chosen to shut me out. I realized I needed to reclaim my life. My happiness couldn't depend on a text message that might never come. I had to find myself again, outside of being mom. It was terrifying, but also freeing. That day, I signed up for a painting class. Something I had always wanted to do but never found the time for. As I dipped the brush into paint, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The weeks that followed were difficult, but slowly I began to rebuild. The painting class introduced me to new friends, people who didn't know me as Anna, the mother who was pushed aside, but simply as Anna. I started volunteering at a local shelter, filling my days with purpose instead of waiting for calls that never came. But more importantly, I began to let go of the constant need for his approval. Did it hurt? More than I could ever explain. But with every brushstroke, every laugh shared with new friends, every small act of kindness I gave and received, I felt stronger. For the first time in months, I wasn't defined by what I had lost. I was beginning to be defined by what I could still build, and deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Weeks turned into months, and I had started to accept my new life without constant contact from my son. Then one evening my phone rang. His name flashed across the screen, and my heart leapt the way it always used to. I answered quickly, my voice trembling.
Hello?
"Hi, Mom," he said, his tone hesitant. I need a favor. It wasn't what I had hoped for. He didn't call to ask how I was or to invite me over. He needed something. His car had broken down, and he couldn't reach anyone else. Could I give him a ride to work the next morning? A mix of emotions hit me. Part of me was thrilled just to hear his voice, to be needed, even if it was for something small. Another part of me felt the sting of realization. I had become a convenience, not a priority. But I agreed. At dawn, I pulled up to his driveway. He came out quickly, not inviting me in, just sliding into the passenger seat with a hurried thanks. We drove mostly in silence, though every now and then he glanced at me with that familiar guilt in his eyes. When we reached his office, he paused before getting out. "Thanks, Mom, really, I'll call you soon." I smiled and nodded, but as I watched him walk away, I knew better. That call, like so many before it, was just a fleeting moment. I couldn't build my world on the hope of crumbs. I had to keep focusing on myself. And yet, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Maybe one day he would remember that I wasn't just someone to call in emergencies. Maybe one day he'd remember I was his mother. I leaned more into my new routines. The painting classes became my sanctuary. Colors on the canvas gave me a language for my pain, my hope, and my healing. Other women in the class, many of them mothers themselves, began to open up about their struggles too. I realized I wasn't alone. Others had faced rejection, distance, and heartbreak. We laughed together, we cried together, and slowly I began to feel alive again. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was creating. The shelter where I volunteered became another source of strength. The children there, hungry for love and attention, reminded me that motherhood wasn't just about biology. It was about giving, nurturing, and being present for those who needed it most. Each day I gave my love freely. I felt the emptiness shrink. Maybe my son had shut me out, but that didn't mean my capacity to love had to wither. One night, unable to sleep, I sat down with a notebook and began writing a letter to my son. I poured out everything, the pain, the memories, the rejection, and the love that still burned fiercely inside me. I wrote about the nights I stayed up when he was sick, the sacrifices I made so he could chase his dreams, and the ache I felt now that I was no longer part of his life. My tears smeared the ink as I confessed, "I don't want to lose you, but I also can't keep breaking myself just to be near you." When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. But I didn't send it. Something told me it wasn't time, not yet. Maybe one day he would be ready to hear my truth. Until then, the letter stayed tucked away in my drawer, a silent testimony to the love I refused to let die. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. One Saturday, while shopping for groceries, I turned a corner and there they were, my son and his wife. For a moment, all three of us froze. His wife gave a polite nod, but her eyes carried the same wall of distance I had felt for months. My son stepped forward awkwardly. "Hi, Mom." It was small talk after that, weather, work, nothing of substance. But I noticed something in his expression, hesitation. Like there were words he wanted to say but couldn't, not with her standing there. When they walked away, I stood in the aisle clutching my cart, my heart torn. It was a reminder that while I was healing, the wound was still open. I still longed for him, even if I was learning to live without him. As the months rolled on, something unexpected happened. I began to feel joy again. Real joy. Not the fragile kind that depended on someone else's approval, but the kind that bloomed from within. I painted my first full landscape, and my teacher hung it in the studio window. I laughed so hard at book club one evening that tears rolled down my cheeks. At the shelter, one of the kids hugged me tightly and whispered, "You feel like a mom." In that moment, I realized my life still had meaning, even if my son couldn't or wouldn't see it right now. My legacy didn't end with rejection. It was still being written in every brushstroke, every laugh, every hug. Then came the day that shifted everything. At a community event, I saw my son across the room. He was with his wife, of course, but for once she wasn't the focus of his attention. His eyes found me. For a brief second, the mask slipped. I saw guilt, sorrow, and maybe even longing in his gaze. He didn't approach me, not with her beside him, but the look spoke louder than words. I left the event with my heart pounding. For so long, I had felt erased, unwanted. But that look told me the story wasn't over. Somewhere inside him, the boy who once adored his mother still existed. He was just buried under layers of fear, pressure, and influence. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe maybe, just maybe, our story wasn't finished. The night my son told me not to come, I sat at home staring at the walls. The silence felt louder than any storm, but something inside me refused to just sit and accept being erased. I didn't want to intrude, but I also couldn't silence the gnawing question in my mind. What was happening at that dinner that was so important I had to be excluded? So with a mix of nerves and defiance, I drove past his house. I told myself I would just pass by, nothing more. But as I slowed near the driveway, I saw through the dining room window. There they were. My son, his wife, her parents, and even family friends gathered around the long table I had helped him pick when he first moved in. Candles glowed, laughter spilled out, plates of food were passed around. And at the head of the table sat my son, beaming with a smile I hadn't seen in years. It hit me like a blade. He wasn't missing me. He wasn't fighting for me. He was performing for them. I parked further down the street, out of sight, and sat in my car. Part of me felt ashamed, like I was spying, but another part whispered, "You deserve to know the truth." I watched long enough to realize the pattern. Every time I wasn't there, he looked free. His wife's smile was wide, her laughter effortless. The moment I entered the picture, she turned cold and distant, and he followed suit. Seeing it laid bare hurt more than I can explain. But here's the thing. Instead of breaking me, it lit something inside me. For the first time, I understood the real battle. This wasn't just about me being excluded from one dinner. This was about control, about being erased slowly, meal by meal, holiday by holiday, until one day I'd no longer exist in his life. That realization burned through my tears. Sitting in my car, I whispered to myself, "Not anymore. I won't let them write me out of my own family." I didn't knock on the door. I didn't create a scene. I simply drove home. But my heart was no longer crushed. It was steady. That dinner had shown me the truth, and the truth gave me clarity. This wasn't about begging for a seat at the table. It was about reclaiming my voice, even if it meant building a new table of my own. Spring arrived with the promise of renewal, but for me, it was another reminder of what I had lost. Easter had always been a family holiday, filled with egg hunts, laughter, and big dinners around my table. That year, I waited for an invitation, a call, even a text. Nothing came. Scrolling online, I stumbled across a picture that nearly broke me. My son, his wife, and her entire family seated around a festive table, pastel eggs scattered across plates, everyone smiling as though life were perfect. The caption read, "Blessed to spend Easter with the people who matter most, the people who matter most." I wasn't there. I wasn't even thought of. The hurt was sharp, but instead of collapsing into tears, something hardened inside me. This wasn't just about a dinner or a holiday. This was about being erased, and I couldn't allow myself to keep waiting for an invitation that would never come. That night, I put away the Easter decorations I had been saving for when my son might come. The pastel tablecloth, the little bunny figurines, all of it went into a box. For the first time, I didn't leave them out as a silent prayer. I put them away as a declaration. I wouldn't keep waiting at the door of a life I wasn't welcome in. A few weeks later, I gathered my courage and called my son. When he answered, his voice was wary, as if bracing for a storm. "Can we talk?" I asked. There was a pause. "Now's not a good time, Mom. She's home." I clenched my jaw. "Then make time, please." Reluctantly, he agreed to meet me at a small diner. When he walked in, I noticed how tired he looked, but also how guarded. I tried to smile, but the words I'd been holding back came rushing out. "Why, Daniel? Why have you shut me out? What did I do that was so wrong?" He stared at his coffee, silent. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "Mom, she feels like you're too controlling. She says you're always trying to insert yourself." My hands trembled. "Insert myself? Daniel, I'm your mother. I only want to be part of your life. Is that so wrong?" He looked torn, but his next words gutted me. "I need you to respect my marriage. If that means less involvement, then that's what it has to be." I left the diner with tears burning my eyes. Respecting his marriage meant erasing myself from his life, and that was something I could no longer accept. That night, alone in my kitchen, I reached the breaking point. I had been patient, I had been understanding, I had swallowed insult after insult. But hearing my son frame my love as too controlling shattered something inside me. I walked through the house, past the pictures of him as a boy, past the trophies I had dusted for years, past the reminders of every sacrifice I had made. My hands shook as I gathered the photos and placed them into a box. Not to throw them away, never that, but to give myself space. For too long, my identity had been tethered to being his mother. And now, being his mother felt like being punished. I realized I had to reclaim myself, not just as Mom, but as Anna, a woman with her own worth, her own dreams, her own right to be seen. That night, for the first time, I didn't cry myself to sleep. Instead, I whispered to the darkness, "No more begging, no more waiting. I will not be invisible." The next morning, I did something bold. I booked a weekend trip for myself, a small cabin by the lake 2 hours away. I had never gone anywhere alone before. Vacations were always about family, about making sure everyone else was happy. The cabin was quiet, surrounded by pine trees and the gentle lap of water against the shore. I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my phone to buzz. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. I hiked, I wrote in my journal, I painted a sunset that reflected across the lake. Each moment was mine alone, and instead of loneliness, I felt peace. I realized I had been living like a guest in my own life, always waiting for scraps of love. But here, in the stillness, I discovered something powerful. I could create joy for myself. When I returned from the trip, a friend pulled me aside. "Anna, I don't know if you've heard, but your son and his wife are having problems." My heart sank, even though I had no reason to be surprised. The cracks I had sensed were now widening. Apparently, his wife had been arguing with him about money, about control, about family. For a moment, I felt guilty. Wasn't this what I had wanted? For him to see her true colors? But guilt quickly gave way to another realization. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about being right. It was about finally understanding that I had never been the problem. One night, just past midnight, my phone rang. It was my son. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Can I come over?" Minutes later, he was at my door looking broken. His eyes were red, his hands trembling. He collapsed onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. She said she doesn't want me talking to you anymore. She said it's either her or you. I froze, my heart torn in two. Part of me wanted to scream, "Why did you let it get this far?" Another part simply wanted to hold him, like I used to when nightmares chased him as a child. Instead, I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, you don't have to choose me or her, but you do have to choose yourself. What kind of life do you want to live?" He looked at me, tears streaming down his face, and whispered, "I don't know anymore." That night marked a turning point, not just for him, but for me. For the first time, my son saw the cost of the choices he had made. And for the first time, I realized that healing wasn't about waiting for him to return. It was about standing firm in who I was, whether he came back or not. In the weeks that followed, I stopped tiptoeing around my pain. I owned it. I talked about it in my support group. I painted it onto canvases. I even shared my story with other women who nodded through tears, saying, "Me too." And slowly, I began to see my son differently, not as the boy I raised, not as the man who hurt me, but as someone caught in his own storm. I couldn't save him. I couldn't fix his marriage, but I could stand strong in myself. I was no longer the woman waiting for scraps of love. I was Anna, and my story was far from over. After that night when my son broke down on my couch, I sat at my desk and poured my heart into a letter. Page after page, I wrote everything I had held inside for years. The pain of being excluded, the humiliation of reading texts that said I wasn't wanted, the endless ache of watching him drift away. I wrote about the sacrifices, the nights I worked 2 jobs so he could have new shoes for school, the birthday cakes I stayed up past midnight to frost, the way I cheered the loudest at every game. I wrote about the love that had never wavered, no matter how he treated me. By the time the ink dried, my hands were shaking. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and stared at his name written across it. But I never mailed it, because the letter wasn't for him. It was for me. It was my closure, my release. It was proof that my love had been real, even if it had been rejected. I tucked it into my journal, a private reminder that I had said my piece, even if he never read it. For so long, my world revolved around my son and the family I thought I had. When that world fell apart, I was left with silence. But silence doesn't have to mean emptiness. It can mean space for something new. I started small. A neighbor invited me to a book club, and instead of making an excuse, I went. I joined a painting class at the community center, nervous at first, but quickly realizing how freeing it was to create among people who encouraged me. Slowly, I built a new circle. These weren't people who judged me or saw me as too controlling. They saw me as Anna, the woman who laughed at silly jokes, who painted sunsets, who had stories worth listening to. It wasn't the family I lost, but it was the family I chose. And in that choice, I began to heal. One evening, my son showed up again. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "She left me," he whispered. The words hit like a stone in water, rippling through me. For years I had imagined this moment, wondered if it would feel like victory, like justice. But standing there, looking at his broken face, I felt no triumph, only sorrow. He sat at my table, the same table he once refused to invite me to, and poured his heart out. His wife had grown colder, more demanding. She had isolated him not only from me, but from his friends. He confessed that deep down he had known for years, but pride had kept him from admitting it. "Mom," he said, voice cracking, "I thought I was protecting my marriage, but I destroyed my relationship with you in the process. I don't know if you can ever forgive me." I reached across the table, placed my hand over his, and whispered, "Forgiveness isn't the hard part. Trust is. His tears fell freely, and for the first time I let myself cry with him. Not for what was lost, but for what still might be rebuilt. Though I welcomed him back into my life, I knew things couldn't return to the way they were. Pain had changed me. I wasn't the mother who would drop everything at the first knock. I wasn't going to be invisible in my own story again. We talked long and hard about boundaries. I told him plainly, if you want to rebuild this relationship, it has to be mutual. No more secrets, no more silence, and no more choosing me only when she isn't looking. He nodded, his shame visible, but I held firm. Reconciliation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it. For once, I didn't shrink back. I didn't settle for scraps. Months passed, and slowly my son became a regular part of my life again. We shared coffee on Sunday mornings, we cooked dinner together, sometimes even sat in comfortable silence as he helped me fix things around the house. It wasn't perfect. Trust doesn't bloom overnight, but each moment, each shared laugh was a small stitch in the fabric that had been torn. For the first time in years, I began to feel not just like his mother, but like his friend. As I grew older, I realized that my legacy wouldn't be defined by how others treated me. It would be defined by how I chose to live despite the hurt. I continued painting, even selling a few pieces at local fairs. I mentored young women at the community center, sharing my story of resilience. I showed them that no matter how broken you feel, you can rebuild. One of them told me, "Anna, you've taught me that family isn't always blood. It's who stands with you when everyone else turns away." Her words stayed with me. Because she was right, my legacy wasn't about being invited to dinners or included in pictures. My legacy was about showing others how to stand tall, even when the world tries to erase you. Years later, at a quiet family dinner, this time at my table, I watched my son laughing with his own children. The sound filled my house in a way I thought I'd lost forever. He caught my eye and raised his glass. "To Mom," he said, voice thick with emotion, "for teaching me what real love looks like even when I didn't deserve it." Tears blurred my vision, but they were different tears this time. Not of pain, not of loss, but of gratitude, because I had learned the hardest truth of all. Love isn't about never breaking. It's about finding the strength to rebuild, even stronger than before. And as laughter echoed through the house, I knew I had built my own legacy, one of resilience, love, and unshakable strength.